I'm joined by the Deputy Prime Minister and Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Nick Clegg. Thank you for joining us. Nick Clegg, in your New Year message, you talked a lot about fairness and the importance of building a fairer economy. We were hearing Jeremy Irons talk a little bit about that a moment ago. What is fair, really, about this £500 benefit cap, which is being discussed tomorrow in the House of Lords? There are a lot of really quite poor families and young people who are going to be put into a very, very difficult situation by this.
I think the central argument, which is one that I fully support, and I completely back Ian Duncan-Smith on this, is to say, look, it surely can't be fair, can't be right, that you can be earning, if you like, more on benefits than someone going out earning £35,000, which is the equivalent if you were to go out and work. And I think, of course, we need to look at transitional arrangements, and Ian Duncan-Smith has made it quite clear that we need to do that, and look at obviously the place of children who are born, if you like, innocently into another set of rules.
So
but the basic principle that cap should be there of £500, so that you can't on benefits earn more than you would if you actually went out and worked. I think that's got to be a simple principle that most people would subscribe to.
If that is the principle, can you do more as a government for very large numbers of younger people who are going to be caught by this and be in real difficulty?
Well, firstly, I think there were some quite sort of apocalyptic predictions being made about exactly what will happen, some of
them coming from the Department of Work and Pensions, actually.
No, we don't actually recognise a lot of those predictions, and this is not going to be some sort of punitive programme of mass homelessness. That is not going to happen. Yeah. Of course, we won't allow that to happen. But we are saying, in general terms about the welfare system, that under Labour it ran out of control. But it's a very important point, because I think it's really crucial that the country as a whole feels that they can support a welfare system on which, by the way, I think over the last year, if you include pensions, we've spent over £200 billion, which everyone believes is fair. And I think the cap is a crucial part of that, not least to increase the incentives to work.
Could you, for instance, however, look at excluding child benefit from that cap? Because that would help those families who have, children in a particularly difficult situation. One thing you could do.
Well, I think that if you did that, it probably wouldn't make much sense trying to have a cap at all.
So no.
But no, I think highly unlikely that we would do that. It wouldn't make much sense. But look, Ian Duncan-Smith has said we'll look at the transitional arrangements. There's a lot of detail involved in that. A lot of that is not fully decided or resolved yet. But the central principle that you can't on benefits earn more than you would if you went out and earned £35,000 before tax, I think is one that most people in the country recognise as a good thing in the context of a very major reform of welfare, which we are, as a coalition government, and all sides of the coalition government support this, implementing, because we believe that it's better to give people incentives to work, and that work should always pay.
What would it say for the legacy of the coalition if at the time of the next election we still have, as we do now, more than 1 million young people unemployed, many of them having their entire lives ruined because they'll never have the experience of work, they'll never get properly into and those lives will be wasted?
I think it's one of the biggest issues which faces us as a society. By the way, it's one of the biggest issues which seem to confront all developed economies in this very difficult time. There's been a problem of long-term youth unemployment or underemployment for some time. It's been remorselessly increasing since 2004. So even in the good times, when there was pots of money in the government's coffers, there was a problem that employers were passing over young people in favour of others. Now, we're doing
you have to do more about it than you're doing at the moment.
But in November, you may recall, I announced that from April this year, we are starting something called the Youth Contract, which is £1 billion we put towards this, which gives every single 18 to 24-year-old the opportunity to earn or learn. And just by way of comparison, Labour's own plan is for a job creation scheme for only 90,000 youngsters. Ours will benefit close to half a million, 500,000 youngsters, or close to 500,000. So it is a very, very ambitious programme to give every single 18 to 24-year-old the chance to either take a work experience place or a form of subsidised employment or an apprenticeship. Because we recognise, quite right, as you say, that it's a huge issue.
Right, and it's going to be a lower unemployment. Youth unemployment will be considerably lower by the time of the next election as a result of this.
Well, I'm saying we are straining every sinew to make sure that we get people out of this this debilitating condition where they're sitting at home, sending out work application forms, not getting any replies, feeling cut off, because, as you say, that can have a long-term scarring effect on young people.
And given all of that, you as a coalition government will have failed at the next election if you haven't got unemployment down.
Well, clearly it's a collective failure if we don't do the right thing by our young people.
OK, so you agree with that?
But what I'm not doing is making numerical predictions. What I am saying to you is that, and this is something I very much push through government, we are implementing by far the most ambitious programme to try and deal with this, around far more ambitious than the official opposition's own offering from the Labour Party.
There is, as you know, a lot of criticism about the overall balance in the way these things are funded. The IFS, which is hardly a kind of wild left-wing body, said that the budget changes overall were a takeaway from families with poorer families with children and a giveaway to people further up the income scale. Again, I challenge you, this is not fairness in action.
Well, just on fairness, what are the building blocks of building a fairer economy, fairer society out of the rubble that we inherited because of the crash in 2008? I would single out three things. Firstly, it is the fair thing to do to try and clear the decks for the next generation so they don't pay off our debt. So you've got to fill in the black hole in the public finances, otherwise you unfairly impose that burden on the next generation. Secondly, you've got to rebalance the economy away from an over-reliance on the City of London, sort out the banking system, sort out excess and executive pay. And the third thing, and this is where I think we still need to be bolder, is make sure that the tax system is fair and make sure that we really do alleviate the burden of taxation on people on low and middle incomes.
I come back to that IFS analysis. What is fair about that?
The IFS analysis, for instance, ignores the fact that we're installing a very progressive policy of a pupil premium in schools, £2.5 billion of additional money to help children from deprived
They were talking about the overall effect of the tax and benefit changes at the last budget.
I'm saying they don't. That's not the way people live their lives. They live their lives in school. They live their lives in preschool support. That analysis, for instance, overlooked the fact that for the first time ever, again, something that I was very keen we should do, for the first time ever, every 2-year-old from every deprived family in this country will receive 15 hours of free preschool support. Now, you shouldn't just blithely ignore these things. These are very major changes. And
I was just quoting the IFS. I'm sorry, but you've got so much to talk about. I'd like to move on.
Just a very important point. This issue of how do you promote fairness at a time of austerity is, I think, the big question facing every progressive party, not just in Britain, but across the developed world. And what is so extraordinary is that Labour, particularly with its latest sort of twisting and turning, has completely ducked out of that debate, is not offering anything to the millions of people in this country, in the centre ground of British society, who want politicians and parties who combine credibility on the economy and compassion and fairness in how we run our society.
Fairness at the other end of the scale. Story today that the mansion tax, a tax on houses worth more than £2 million, is actually being seriously considered by the government. Because we'd always thought the Conservatives would say no to this. We know it was a Liberal Democrat proposal. Is that a real runner now?
I think all that the newspapers have said this morning is restate the flamingly obvious, which is that this is something that was in the Liberal Democrat manifesto. We think that is part of a patchwork of measures which would, over time, make the tax system fairer, because it would ask people who have got very considerable wealth to make a greater contribution and then allow us to use that money. This is the key bit, by the way. Everyone fixates on the mansion tax. Actually, we're not just interested in a mansion tax or wealth taxes for the hell of it. We want to do that to generate the revenue so we can actually alleviate taxes. In other words, but it's very important.
My question is a slightly different one. Is this real? Is it going to happen? Are you winning over Conservative supporters, Conservatives, to support this measure?
I'll tell you what I think we are winning. I think we are winning the argument that we need to be bolder on making the tax system fairer still. On that, I think there is a widespread recognition that when there are many, many people, hard-pressed, hard-working families in this country who've had to face high inflation, particularly over the last year, who in many cases are struggling to pay the monthly, the weekly bills, it is crucial that what we put at the forefront of all our efforts is to make sure the tax system works for them. I want this government to be be absolutely rooted in the centre ground of British politics on the side of hard-pressed, hard-working families, and that should be reflected in what we do in the tax system. The tax system shouldn't be constantly catering for a very small fraction of people at the top. It should be there standing up for the vast majority of people in this country.
And in the context of that, you own the Royal Bank of Scotland, I own the Royal Bank of Scotland, all those people watching own the Royal Bank of Scotland. Given that, can you ensure, are you able to stop its chief executive getting a £1.5 million, £2 million bonus at a time when the bank's performance has been poor?
Look, if it was left up to me, probably up to you, and probably up to many people watching this programme, we wouldn't have any bonuses, particularly in the state-owned banks, while they are still being repaired from the terrible sort of...
But you are Deputy Prime Minister of a state that owns this bank.
Well, hang on, in a spectacular example of irresponsible capitalism, the last government not only let the banks get away with blue murder, then they entered into contracts with them which allow them to continue to pay themselves large bonuses. Now, whether you like it or not, I don't particularly like it, we are constrained by those contractual obligations.
So there's nothing you can do to stop that happening?
No, there are things we've done, which is the second best thing, which we are doing. So we're saying there is a very strict limit on the cash bonuses that bankers can receive, £2,000 only, and we've been very, very clear that in RBS, and for that matter in other banks, the bonus pool has got to be considerably lower than it was last year. And by the way, very helpfully, the Bank of England, the Financial Services Authority is saying exactly the same thing, because any money that is spare should, where possible, be used to repair the bank's balance sheets.
But, just to be absolutely clear about this, if next week or the week after we pick up a newspaper headline and it says Stephen Hester to get £1.5 million, a £2 million bonus.
RBS have said that is pure speculation. They haven't agreed that yet.
They have.
And there has been no agreement yet.
Sure.
Because as you quite rightly say, there's an arm's length body called the UKFI that represents our interests in these decisions, and they haven't yet arrived at a decision on RBS bonuses.
I did start the sentence with the word if, but to be clear, if that happened, you as a government can do nothing about it.
No, what we are doing...
About that particular instance.
But you're asking me about a hypothetical outcome that I don't believe will arise, because what we've been very clear about now, before those talks and negotiations takes place, is what we want to see. Lower bonuses, more money being put into repairing the balance sheet, and much lower bonus pool than last year.
But you would be outraged if it did arise. You think that would be wrong in your view?
If there was no change in the bonus behaviour of this year compared to last year, of course I'd be outraged. It's not going to happen.
OK. Let's turn to another big story today, which is what sounds like a pretty blistering report from the Health Select Committee about the government's health reforms. Liberal Democrat MP on that, Conservative MP on that, Conservative MP, ex-Health Minister chairing that committee, serious committee. And what they're saying, in effect, is that these health reforms aren't worth it. They're diverting the NHS from the business of making savings and improving patient care. Isn't this a reform or a change which simply isn't worth the candle?
Well, firstly, I haven't seen the Select Committee report. The reports of it suggest that what they're focusing on, which is an entirely legitimate question, is the interaction between the reforms and the £20 million worth of savings that, let's remember, the last government insisted the NHS should make. That's a totally fair question. And they seem to be, according to the reports, floating this idea of greater integration between social care and healthcare, something I've always believed is a good thing. We're doing quite a lot of that already. If we need to do more, we can always try and do so. But I'd like to be really clear. Firstly, we have gone a long way to allay the concerns that people had about the original blueprint of the reform. So we've said there's going to be no privatisation, certainly no privatisation of the NHS by the back door. We've put competition, if you like, back in its box, if you like. We've made sure there's proper accountability in the NHS. But people shouldn't think that the best way to cherish and preserve everything that we love about the NHS is somehow to sort of freeze it in time and then it'll all be OK.
I don't think people are saying that, but having said it, let me turn it around.
Sure.
Given that, all the royal colleges are against this, given that, virtually every health expert is against these changes, given what's going on in the House of Lords at the moment, what is so great, so important about this legislation that it's worth spending so much political capital forcing it through?
Well, I think let's boil it right down to basically what these reforms are about. Basically what these reforms are about is that the people who should have a greater role in the NHS about what happens to you and I as patients and everybody else who are patients in the NHS should be people who know a thing or two about patients. Doctors, nurses, clinicians and so on. That seems to me to be a really simple, common sense, new reform. Give more authority about how money sloshes around the system to people who know patients best. That is the simple animating force behind these reforms. Yes, there's a lot of complexity. Of course there's controversy. No one likes change in something that we all cherish and love as much as the NHS.
This is a committee led by a former Conservative Health Secretary.
But Andrew, as I said, I think...
Are you not saying that you have to look at this again?
Of course we'll look at the report. I haven't seen the report. When we see the report, it's a select committee report, like all select committee reports. We'll look at it. And as I said, there's a totally legitimate question about how you conduct reform when at the same time you're making savings. Our view is these reforms, by making people in the front line more responsible for the use of NHS money, actually help make those savings, not hinder it.
But you are open to rethinking.
Well, look, I can only go by what I read in the papers. If, for instance, one of the ideas is that we should seek to do more to integrate social care and health care, I think most people know.
Yeah, but that's written. Well, the burden of this is they don't like the reforms, as you know.
No, anyway, then we're reading different reports. But look, let's wait and see what the report says. Okay. As I say, I think no one should believe that we're somehow helping the NHS by sticking our head in the sand and saying no change. When you've got an ageing population, an increasing cost in medicines and medical procedures, you have to reform things, update things, precisely to preserve what is best about the NHS.
Let's move on to some other issues, if we may. Are you against or in favour of a new airport for the South East?
I'm totally unpersuaded that by the evidence, and I think we should take a common-sense, hard-headed look at the facts. I don't think we should, as a country, decide to concrete over vast swathes of the Thames estuary on a whim. Let's look at the problem, and that's why we're going to issue a document in March for consultation, for people's views, because there is an issue about what we do with our airports, particularly in the South East. As it happens, if you look at the facts, we have 4 big airports around London, 3 of which aren't even being used to capacity yet. Now, call me old-fashioned, but it seems to me you should first look at things like that before you decide to do something which, which in any event would not be built for another decade and a half.
But at the moment, you're opposed, unless you're persuaded otherwise, would be the right way of putting it.
I'm opposed, but as I say, let's look at the facts. Let's be hard-headed about the facts, about the economic impact, the environmental impact, and not simply lurch from one great big project to the next.
If a member of the government is charged with a criminal offence, do they have to resign?
Of course, that's a very serious issue if that were to arise. But I know you're, of course, quite understandably alluding to Chris Huhne. He has been crystal clear that he denies any wrongdoing. He said that to me. He said that publicly. And I just think, if you don't mind, I'm not going to provide a running commentary without knowing what the CPS is going to do.
The one thing that I think you could, if I may say, provide a commentary on is whether, in the event of somebody being charged with a criminal offence, they would have to leave the government. Because that has been... I don't think the actual ministerial code says that in black and white, but that has been what's happened in the
obviously, the Cabinet Secretary, as the arbiter of these things, can provide advice, and the Prime Minister and myself and others would need to take a view. But we as a government want the highest standards of probity to be in place in everything that is done by Cabinet members. And that's why we've increased dramatically the transparency about what Cabinet members and members of the government do, who they meet, and so on. But
if you couldn't have a trial going on and somebody being in government at the same time,
if you don't mind, because I think anything I say on this will be wildly misinterpreted or overinterpreted one way or the other. Chris Huhne has been very clear that he denies any wrongdoing, and I think the wheels of justice, so to speak, should be allowed to take their own course.
And by the by, would you like to see David Laws back now? Has he done his time, as it were?
I would like to see David Laws back in government, because not just because I admire him a lot and he's a close colleague and friend of mine. I just so happen to think it'd be very good for the government, good for Britain. In my view, he's got one of the most sophisticated minds in British politics.
Your deputy in the party, Simon Hughes, has called this morning for an English Parliament. Do you agree with him?
No, I don't agree with Simon on that. Simon has had views on this for many years.
You don't think the English are underrepresented in the system?
Do you know, I really think at a time when the central argument is about the wisdom of wrenching Scotland out of the United Kingdom, let's focus on that debate and let's get the SNP to provide basic answers to some pretty basic... I mean, you would have thought for a party whose whole sole purpose in life is to advocate independence, they would have been able to provide answers about what it means for defence, for taxation, for investment, for the currency, and that's what I think we should focus on.
OK, there is a proposal floating around under which Britain would be providing more money for the IMF bailout fund for the euro. Is that something that we ought to do as a country?
Oh, I think we ought to, and the Chancellor was very clear about this just last week. We must always be strong supporters of the IMF. The IMF is a linchpin. It was in many ways a British invention in the creation of these great Bretton Woods institutions in the post-war period. It's a linchpin in creating a system of stability.
So we will contribute more if we're asked
We
to.
will always make our fair contribution to the IMF when the IMF says and shows that those increased contributions are necessary.
Last time we were talking, you said that you were going to have to work very hard to ensure that Britain was still inside the European tent. How's it going?
Well, there's a considerable effort that's been put in by me, by the Prime Minister. We're actually working together on this to make sure that, notwithstanding whatever happened last year in the summit in early December, on the crucial question of how you create growth and jobs, deepening the single market, making it easier for businesses to work across borders within the European Union. We're actually working very hard and finding a lot of strong alliances with Germany. I've had meetings with and conversations with a range of leaders of governments, with the Italian Prime Minister.
Lots of kissing, lots of making up.
No, hang on. But this leads, I hope, to some quite important decisions which should be taken at the next summit on the 30th of January to make sure that we create more growth and more jobs in Europe, because austerity alone will not get Europe out of its present difficulties.
Nick Clegg, for now, thank you very much indeed.